core. The advantage of some of these techniques are a couple of things. Besides that you have different tools for different jobs and therefore they probably do that work better, you're also being a lot more efficient with the material available. Now, I mean, stone doesn't strike us as a thing that is hard to come by, but remember, a lot of stone is not good to make a stone tool. If I were to go out and pick up any old piece of granite and try to make a tool out of it, I might get something vaguely usable, but it wouldn't be sharp and it wouldn't be good. The stone isn't homogeneous enough, like this obsidian here, that's basically the same in every direction you go. It's the same material, and so energy moves through it evenly, and so you get these nice sharp edges that come off the pieces made from it. Good stone making good stone tool making material is hard to come by. So if you are a Homo habilis who can just sort of smack two stones together, this top piece up here, out of half a kilogram, about a pound of flint, this good stone tool, you might get 8 centimeters of cutting edge here. You'll hack at it once or twice, you'll get a good cutting edge, you can use it until that wears out, then you're not going to know quite what to do with it, you're going to throw it away and you're going to get a new piece from wherever you can, or wait until you can find another piece. If you're an Homo erectus who can make a hand axe, you can get about 30 centimeters of good cutting edge out of that same piece of half a kilogram of flint. Mousterian technology is a lot more complex, and Neanderthals here were being able to use the Levallois technique to make a bunch of tools that had a lot more cutting edge out of the same amount of material, up to about 90 centimeters of cutting edge from the same chunk of stone. You can also sort of see a preview here of what's going to happen next when you get to fully anatomically modern humans doing things that are extremely complicated, basically using the brains that would be familiar to any of us to make stone tools, where they get up to 9 meters of cutting edge by making composite tools by using flakes rather than the whole stone to make tools, but we'll get to that. What about culture? I mean, what about the Neanderthal culture? Do they have a culture? I mean, we're talking about these brains that are getting more and more like ours over the course of hominin development. Homo habilis is starting to be able to picture the future in a symbolic way that is kind of similar to our brains. What about Neanderthals? Well, we have some evidence to suggest that, yeah, maybe they're actually more similar to us than we might imagine. And some of the most spectacular evidence for that comes from a site called Shanidar, a cave in northern Iraq in the Zagros Mountains, that big mountainous region that's in between northern Iraq and Iran. And there's this cave, you see an image of it here, and then we're looking sort of at a cutaway of an outline of what the cave is, the sort of shape of the cave here. And all of these little things here are much more recent constructions of buildings. People have been living in this cave for a long time. The big sort of keyhole-shaped thing in the middle of this is the excavations that were used to excavate much further down in the history of the cave. And that's where they found the Neanderthal occupation. And in fact, they found not only things connected to Neanderthals, but they found Neanderthals themselves. The Shanidar cave produced, I believe it was 7 burials of Neanderthals. And when I say the word burial, I mean burial. We're not looking at just a few bones that happened to be dragged in here by a hyena that found a body. We're looking at an intentional burial practice. When a Neanderthal died, other Neanderthals intentionally dug a hole in the ground in this cave, put the body in, and covered them up. On its own, this does not necessarily mean culture in a way we'd be familiar with, right? I mean, maybe it's just that grandma starts to smell bad and so you stick her in a hole to get rid of her, right? We think that probably we're not looking at that. We think we're actually looking at something that's much more intentional and suggests that these guys were thinking about their loved ones in a way that's more familiar to us, right? That there were loved ones that have been lost and they bury them quite intentionally. Here are some of the indications of that. Here's just some information about Shanidar. I believe there's no star on this, but I'm pretty sure this is in your handouts. Somebody can let me know if it's not. So we're looking at Middle Paleolithic site and occupation that dates from about 40,000 years ago to 70,000 years ago-ish. In the Zagros Mountains of northern Iraq, and it was 7 adults, so 9 burials that were found in this site. And we're finding things that suggest that these people were taking care of each other, that we might recognize the way they took care of each other. So one of the burials was an older, I believe it was a male that was much, much older than some of the other burials. He had a withered arm, an arm that clearly had not been functional for a long time, but he had stayed alive. He had severe arthritis. This person was not running around jumping on buffalo and bringing them down to hunt and chasing after deer. And he was clearly blind in one eye. I think it was a sort of a trauma that was healed up over the course of the eye, in the area of the eye. This person lived with these injuries for a very long time. By himself, he almost certainly would have died. But someone was bringing food back to this person. You know, in an economic sense, in a purely economic sense, as soon as grandma or grandpa is unable to hunt and provide food or be otherwise useful to you, the evolutionarily smart thing to do is to ditch them, right? They're not helpful to me anymore. Out the window you go, grandma. But we're not making that choice, right? We don't do that, and these Neanderthals weren't doing that either. We've got two women and a child and a man buried together. We have indications that the child's skull was slightly deformed by something pressing up against it. This is a practice that's widely found across modern living cultures. It's called cradle boarding. And when you are a new mother who has a very small infant and you need to go and hoe the field and gather the food that you need to survive, you don't go up and pay maternity leave. You know, there's no such thing out there. There's no such thing generally in most places in this country either, anyway, sadly. What you do is you take that very small child and you strap them to your back. And that child is there, and when you need to feed that child or take care of it, or if you're running away from a predator, that child is coming along with you. If you tie it tightly enough, it'll be protected from doing damage to itself, but it also may get, because the skull is so soft, it may start growing with a sort of a flattened patch on the back where it was attached to the board. Usually as an adult this will resolve itself, but you see that in some examples of modern children. So we're looking again at somebody taking care of this child. The really famous thing about Shanidar Cave, though, is that they collected lots of material, lots of information from it, and somebody had the thought to go look for pollen, microscopic bits of pollen. And they found in one grave a really sharp concentration of a couple of different species, hollyhock, grape hyacinth, and groundsel. These are flowering plants. And the pollen is associated, of course, with the flowers. That's what the bees are attracted to, and that's why plants flower. The suggestion is that you're looking at something like this, a burial that was not only intentional, but actually had these other elements. Somebody placed flowers in there with the grave. Was that just a simple, this is beautiful and I'm sad and I miss this person and I'm going to put it in there? Was it a much more complicated idea of, flowers growing and being a fundamental part of the reproduction for a species, and then dying in a sort of a cyclical way that actually makes human beings think of things like birth and death and rebirth in a sort of a much more complicated religious way? I don't know. Is this religion? I don't know. But it's certainly something, right? It's not just ditching grandma because she's starting to smell bad. And that's what the site is really particularly famous for, giving us a little window into the sort of the thoughts of Neanderthals at this time. So here we are. Here's what the world looks like around 200,000 years ago, right? So starting about 200,000 years ago until more recent, about 20, 30, 50,000 years, depending on who you talk to, you've got Neanderthals here in sort of Europe and in Central Asia, sort of Caucasus, Mideast region. You've got other archaic Homo sapiens species in other parts of the world. We don't need to go into the details of what they're called. They're called different things in different places, but there's various archaic species, sort of cousins to the Neanderthal, in East Asia, in South Asia, and there's others in North and all throughout Africa. Nobody over here. We'll get there in a few tens of thousands of years, but there's no human being, no human ancestor ever lived in North or South America until much later. how do we get from this time, 200,000 years ago, where we have all of these different, either different species or at least very different archaic Homo sapiens, very different versions of us in different parts of the world? How do we get from that to now? Because now we only have one. There's only one human species, there's only one human subspecies. Biologically, we are all effectively identical. We've liked, especially in the last 500 years, to make a big deal out of the physical differences between different peoples from different parts of the world. Those differences are biologically meaningless. We are exactly the same for all intents and purposes, and have been for a very long time. For over 100,000 years, every living cousin of ours has been biologically identical to us. As we are now, for all intents and purposes. So how do we get from that? What happens to all these other archaic Homo sapiens forms? Well, the big difference, the first thing is over here, probably in East Africa, certainly in Africa somewhere, we get the emergence of what we'll call anatomically modern humans. Things that are effectively like us. They could probably think like us. If you tried to teach one calculus, they would be able to get it in a way that Homo erectus probably couldn't, no matter how hard you tried. If you taught them a common language, they could converse with you in a way that would probably be familiar. They could manage to run Microsoft Word if you wanted them to, right? They are effectively, for all intents and purposes at least, like us. And they emerged in East Africa probably about 120,000 years ago. How do we get from where they're just emerging there to when there is nothing but us modern Homo sapiens sapiens, throughout the entire world? Well, there's two big arguments, two theories that I alluded to earlier, and here's a sort of an outline of them. It's on the bottom of the screen. They're supposed to say what happened to the Neanderthals. The two theories are the multi-regional theory and the out of Africa number 2 theory. And it's worth pointing out here what the word theory means in science, because for most people, when you use the word theory in like common discussion and common speech, people mean it something like a guess, right? Something that, oh, I don't know, that's just my theory, right? It's just my guess. The word theory has a really specific meaning in science in general, and it means an explanation. Right? The theory of evolution is an explanation for how the process of evolution takes place. The theory of gravity is an explanation for why we don't just go floating off into space. The theories may change. That doesn't necessarily mean the underlying phenomenon they seek to explain has changed. So any argument, for instance, that the theory of evolution is just someone's guess, well, that's only true in the sense that the theory of gravity is just a guess that we don't go floating off into space, right? The different explanations, the details of how evolution works have been understood and are being refined over time. The different explanations of how gravity works is being refined and changed over time. But those changes in those theories, those changes in those explanations, don't change the facts that are seeking to be explained by those theories. So a change to the theory of evolution doesn't change the fact of evolution any more than the change to the theory of gravity changes the fact that we don't float off into space, right? That the fact that gravity exists. So we have these two theories, two different explanations for the process of radiating modern human beings, anatomically modern humans. That's the abbreviation that gets used here, AMH, anatomically modern humans, which is just another way of saying Homo sapiens sapiens, same thing. How is it that they went from East Africa to all over the world? We know they did. Question is how? These are the two explanations that are sort of being debated now. One is the multi-regional theory. And in the multi-regional theory, we suggest that there is an independent evolution of Homo sapiens sapiens all across the different parts of the globe, all at the same time. That evolution happened in multiple regions. Effectively, the archaic Homo sapiens in Asia evolved into modern Asians. The archaic Homo sapiens in Africa evolved into modern Africans, and the archaic Homo sapiens in Europe, the ones we've been calling the Neanderthals, evolved into modern Europeans. I want to keep it clear here that this is not an argument for race. It is easy to see that this, okay, well, our modern cultural construction of the idea of race, as in real meaningful physical differences that are permanent and built into modern human variation, We see racial divisions being drawn now between Asians, Africans, and Europeans, so it's easy to see this argument as an argument for race. That is very explicitly not what the people who are espousing this are doing. They are not a bunch of racists, is what I'm saying. They're not suggesting that that is the real fundamental difference between Asians, Europeans, and Africans. The key to that is that there has always been, as this slide shows here, continuous gene flow between these groups, right? So you only have a little bit of connection between Europe and Mideast and Africa across the Sinai, but you've got that. Human beings can walk back and forth across that, and they always have, and all of our ancestors have since Homo erectus first went across that way. They've always been walking back the other direction too. It wasn't a one-directional move. So for the last 1.8 million years, people have been going around the Earth and walking back and forth. And in that process, there are genes being shared. So biological. The archaic Homo sapiens in Asia evolved into modern Asians, but they were sharing all of this genetic material with Africans and Europeans, and so we were one breeding population is the evolutionary term, right? So there is no, this is not an argument for the reality of biological race. But it does suggest that modern Neanderthals are the direct ancestors of modern Europeans and modern human beings, so that our great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandparents, our in the greater human sense, includes direct connections to Neanderthals in a big way, in a large way, and the modern the archaic Homo sapiens in Asia and Africa as well. That all of these species contribute in a big way to what we are now. The other argument, out of Africa number 2, suggests that that's not the case. In fact, the Neanderthals have all died out. All the descendants from the Neanderthals are no longer with us. And the same is true for all of the other archaic Homo sapiens forms. They are no longer around. And what we are, the one species, Homo sapiens sapiens, is the result of a single radiation out of East Africa about 70,000 years ago. This date has been pushed back and forth a lot. I just saw an article a little while ago that argued that it was more like 50,000 years ago. The specifics being worked out, but effectively the argument is that every living person, from every Pacific Islander, Australian Aborigine, Native American, European, African, and Asian, every single living human being has a great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandmother that goes back about 50 to 70,000 years in East Africa, and doesn't include in any substantial way any of the other archaic Homo sapiens forms. So anatomically modern humans, these AMH, emerged in East Africa about 120,000 years, and after about 50,000 years, we've got a radiation out of that spot that effectively replaces all of the other existing forms of hominins everywhere else in the world. Here's the same thing, just in a sort of a visual format. The top is the multi-regional theory, where you've got these different archaic forms here: the Chinese erectus, the Indonesian erectus, European erectus, African erectus, all moving towards modern forms, and with these intermediate groups like Neanderthals in there, evolving directly into modern Europeans, or this one branch that survives all the way to the present from African erectus and spreads out into all these other groups. But all these other archaic Homo sapiens forms are dead ends. They don't contribute substantially to modern DNA. The jury is still a bit out on this, but the current sort of weight of the evidence, in my feeling, is that out of Africa number 2 is the correct description of what's gone on here. That probably in no substantial way are we connected to Neanderthals. Now, I would be really debated that by some people who probably know more about it than I do, since this isn't my area of expertise, but that's sort of the current weight of evidence. And some of that evidence comes at least from genetics. As a counterpoint, I can also say, if you're looking at the news, you will see news stories about finding bits and pieces of Neanderthal DNA in our modern genome. And those are probably right, And they probably do suggest that, if you want to take the strict definition of a species that the biologists have, that it should actually be Homo sapiens neanderthalensis, that we would be able to biologically interbreed and create fertile offspring with a Neanderthal if they were around now. So there is some bit of Neanderthal DNA. Not actually an open and shut case. There are some arguments about where those bits of DNA could have come from, but that's the current evidence for it. The other evidence, though, has to do with human genetic diversity overall. And if you were to sort of map out human genetic diversity like that, here's the past, here's common ancestors, and here's modern populations. And if you think just about if distance on this graph here represents not like geographic distance, but how similar or how different the different genomes are to each other, which has to do with how long ago have they split from each other. If you were to map out all of human genetic diversity and you had something that looked like this much of it would be Africa, and this much of it would be everyone else. All the Asians, all the Australian Aborigines, all the Native Americans, all the Europeans they're much less genetically diverse than the genetic diversity across all of Africa. And what that suggests is that these groups here are a relatively recent offshoot from the groups that were in Africa. And it's got to do with when people left Africa and how much connection there was back and forth between them. All the groups that are already in Africa would be splitting and splitting and splitting across the whole continent. But the groups that left, it seems like it's a relatively recent split. And that suggests that it's a relatively recent common ancestor, again, that's dated to about 70 to 50,000 years ago, depending on who you're talking to, that led to all of the anatomically modern humans that are alive today.